Hello, everybody. A few more might straggle in. I know it was kind of hard to find this room. I'd like to, on behalf of Students for Liberty, welcome you to a session on free market environmentalism versus rogue market environmentalism, how to spot the difference. Your program may say that Ian Murray will be delivering this talk. Presently, Robert Smith will be delivering this talk. Mr. Smith is the director of the Center for Private Conservation, a former CEI project. The CPC documents, prepares case studies on, and publicizes noteworthy examples of private conservation and stewardship on private lands in the U.S. and abroad. R.J. Smith is an adjunct scholar in environmental policy at CEI. He also serves as director of the Center for Private Conservation. Combining a natural sciences background in geology from Stanford University with social sciences and economics from New York University. Mr. Smith began to apply market and property rights solutions to environmental issues, and when he was president of the Audubon Society chapter in 1970, he coined the term free market environmentalism in his book, Earth's Resources, Private Ownership versus Public Waste. Mr. Smith was consultant to the Department of the Interior, the President's Council on Environmental Quality. He served as a special assistant to the EPA. He was a consultant to the Edison Electric Institute and director of environmental studies at the Cato Institute. Currently, he works on wildlife, endangered species, property rights, and property stewardship. Mr. Smith is a popular speaker and has lectured, debated widely, including in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, France, Portugal, Belgium, England, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So, without any further introduction, Robert Smith.
Obviously, I didn't write that, but I'm a popular speaker. We'll find out. What I want to try to cover today is the basic outline of what we in the field call free market environmentalism, and to stress why it's important. I won't go into great detail because I want to try and cover a lot of ground to give you areas that if you're interested in, you've got a lot of room to follow up on and do research yourself, because there are very few people who really have worked in that area of free market environmentalism. And one of the main reason it's important is simply because to this day, this is still considered one of the great Achilles heels of the free market, of a free society. It's believed that this is the environment, protection of the environment, whether it's water pollution, air pollution, whether it's disappearing whales, whether it's forests burning down, whatever it is. But this is a example of market failure. And it's inherent in the free market that they're unable to resolve these issues, and it's still argued today that it's the market that causes environmental degradation. Now, prior to about 1980, the conventional wisdom, essentially throughout the world, but particularly even here in the West, was that the cause of environmental degradation was capitalism. And this was widely believed by almost everybody in the economics field, and especially by people who dealt with environmental economics. And one of the reasons for this is simply that industrial revolution, began in the West. It began in Great Britain and Western Europe, and then went on over to the United States. And so that was where you first saw issues of environmental problems. And it was believed that, and argued that capitalists always acted in their own self-interest. They wanted profits for themselves, but they would pass on the cost and the waste would be dumped on society. And so the answer to this was presumably that only under socialism or communism, where managers of industries acted for the good of all instead of in their own self-interest, would pollution and environmental degradation vanish. Lenin was quoted as sayings that were in his writings that in a communist world, pollution would vanish. Many of the constitutions of the Soviet bloc countries expressly prohibited environmental degradation. And so this was the basic worldview. And it wasn't challenged at all until the early to the mid 1970s, when the first economists from the West and some environmentalists and some geographers and some people from the media were first able to get behind the Iron Curtain. They began to gain access first to Russia, and they were stunned when they saw the levels of environmental degradation in the Soviet Union, particularly water pollution in all the main rivers. The one thing that there was very little pollution of was air pollution, but the main reason for that was that the Soviet Union was still so poor. There was very little in the way of private automobiles, very few cars on the road compared to the West. And so achieving some slightly higher degree of environmental quality simply through poverty or the lack of cars was no real success at all. But this first got a lot of the environmental economists writing books questioning how could they have gone wrong, because they knew the economic theory told them that capitalism was the cause of environmental degradation, and here they were seeing levels of environmental degradation behind the Iron Curtain that they really couldn't believe. And at first this was just sort of amongst the academics, but in 1980 and 81, during the Solidarity movement in Poland, the Polish Ecological Club was created, and it issued broad invitations to bring in particularly journalists from the West. And the level of environmental degradation in Poland, for instance, was far beyond what had even been in the Soviet Union. And environmental economists and some environmentalists were shaken even more because they simply couldn't believe this. And to show the levels that are reached, most of them were taken, who came in on their trips, were taken to Krakow to visit the Sigismund Chapel on Walwell Cathedral, which had a gold dome. And the levels of acid rain were such that the gold was actually dissolving off the gold dome. And those of you who remember your chemistry know that you need agua regia to dissolve gold. And this was the kind of thing that was going on all the time. And then there are also, a little bit later, about 10 years later, when the first economists began to get into China, get behind the bamboo curtain, again they found the same thing. Levels of environmental degradation, destruction of forests, wastelands created, wildlife vanishing just about everywhere. People were eating it because they were starving to death. And the people's war against the birds that was carried out. And so this was one more challenge. So across the board, whether it was in the Soviet Union, whether it was in the Eastern European bloc countries, or whether it was in China, they found levels of environmental degradation that they thought was simply impossible because it challenged their basic theory. And in fact, there was a book that came out in about 1984 or 5, professor of economics at Purdue on environmental degradation in China. And he, in the introduction, he just questioned himself very seriously. He said, how can this possibly be? Because we know our economic theories are right. We know that it's the marketplace, it's self-interest in the marketplace that causes environmental degradation. So how come there's all this pollution? And the only thing he could come up with was that, well, perhaps something went wrong. They selected the wrong leaders in China. If they had different leaders, then it would have vanished and their theories would have held up. Well, it's a little late in the game to believe that somebody other than Mao would have acted in the best interest of the people of China and eliminated all pollution. Now, one of the things that happened was that most of the analysis, the economic analysis that had gone on environmental degradation had been based on the concept of externalities. And supposedly capitalism is characterized by externalities, and particularly negative externalities. These are the waste products that are not internalized by a factory. It's producing air pollution, or it's producing water pollution, and it just dumps it on the rest of society. And supposedly this would not happen under communism, again because you had the managers would be acting for the good of all. But what this basically overlooked was the whole concept of property rights. Because when you get down to most environmental problems and most problems of environmental degradation and pollution, it's a question of property rights. I mean, if you produce a waste product, a harmful waste product, say you produce some slag from your industrial plant and you dump it over the fence on somebody's ground, everybody immediately recognizes that as an invasion of somebody else's property. But when you dumped it into the air instead, or dumped it in the water, and generally people don't make that quick connection so much, and there's a tendency to believe that it's some sort of problem of externalities, negative externalities, when really that too is nothing but a property right, except the property rights system was not really fully developed and was not brought into play in this area. Now, early in the United States, some of the first problems that we had as we were developing property rights law, and particularly basing that on the English system of common law and applying property rights law to environmental problems. When we had, particularly with water pollution, throughout New England, when the first industrialization came, it was usually along the fall line where the waterfalls were, and they put in mills, industrial mills, and then you began to have some problems with riparian property rights. The dams would often flood upstream owners and would cut off a regular quantity and high quality of water to downstream property rights owners. For instance, they might dump the chaff from a grain milling company or something into the water. Or at various times, water levels may fluctuate. Now, initially, what the courts did, they were essentially taking a property rights approach to this and saying that these are private property rights that are involved here, and if somebody, the mill owner, damages or does harm to upstream or downstream property owners, then the property owners could get injunctions to prevent any more harm, and or they could collect compensation for the damages that have been done to them. But one of the things that, interesting things that developed in American law at that time was initially there had been an approach that protected property rights and was beginning to extend the concept of British concept of common law protection and property rights throughout society. But this was halted, short-stopped, by a development of a philosophy in many of the towns and many of the court systems in various counties, and particularly in the states, that argued that on utilitarian grounds, America needed to have rapid growth, it needed to have economic development, and we couldn't simply let, at all times, one single individual landowner, property owner, who had water rights, stand in the way of the good of all, stand in the way of progress. And so increasingly, it became sort of a commonality of interest between the judiciary and, say, state senators or mayors or county supervisors and so on, that we are not going to let individual property rights stand in the way of growth and development in our area. And there's a very interesting book by Horowitz called The Transformation of American Law, 1780 to 1860, which details this trend throughout the northeastern United States. And so it was a switch away from a common law protection of property rights to a utilitarian type view that the bigger you are, the better you were, and bigger people and industrialists had better property rights than small landowners. And the same thing began to develop also with the first test cases on air pollution in the late 1800s and going into the early 1900s. There were many suits that people were bringing if, say, you were downwind of some industrial plant that was putting out some particularly obnoxious gases and fumes that might kill the trees in your orchard, or you had a bakery or a laundry downwind and the products came out worse than people sent them to you originally. The courts were ruling along those lines. But once more, particularly in Pittsburgh and in Chicago, with the great World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, you had all these boomers who knew that the industrialists and the moneyed people, financiers of Europe, were coming to the World's Fair. And one thing they wanted everybody to see was great smokestacks, you know, spewing out smoke and everything to show that this was a mighty American country and a great place to invest your money, and because it was a growing economy and it was a safe place to put your money. And so again, you began to have a shift in the attitude away from protecting property rights from people who were being harmed by air pollution to saying, no, the nation does need to grow, we need economic growth, everybody will be better off for it. Again, a utilitarian view, and this is the direction that we need to go in. And so they began to have more and more cases decided against individual property owners. Now you have to ask yourself, what if property rights had been? And so this is, but what resulted from that, of course, is what everybody says, well look, we have all this industrial pollution, we have air pollution, we have water pollution. This is obviously an example of market failure. No, it wasn't an example of market failure. It was an example of government failure. The failure of government to do the most important thing it is, which is to uphold the rules of a free society and to protect and enforce private property rights, which the governments failed to do and the court systems failed to do. So it's not an example of market failure. One of the things that obviously you would have had a different spatial and geographical location of highly polluting companies, particularly companies that were involved in air pollution. Instead of having, you know, all of those of you who are from New York City area, New Jersey, North Jersey, know all the polluting factories lined up on the west side of the Hudson in New Jersey that spew everything out over onto people in New York City. Well, instead of that, you probably would have had a situation if we had a property rights approach to air pollution, in which more and more of the companies, for instance, would have located on the eastern shore of Long Island. So the pollution was going out over the ocean instead of over people. I mean, that's one of the obvious first things you would have. And then secondly, you would have had a strong incentive to develop, from the very beginning, less polluting processes, manufacturing processes and processes all the way down the line. A classic example of that, some of you may know the Ryan case from Syracuse, New York, where the New York Central Railroad, one of the problems the early railroads had was with sparks coming out from the smokestacks and causing fires everywhere. And there was constant work every year for people working on creation of new spark repressors. And you go to the U.S. Patent Office and there'd be hundreds of patents every year for new and more effective spark repressors. Well, the New York Central was going through Syracuse, New York, and sparks went off and set a wheat field on fire, and the fire raced into town and burned down about half the town. And eventually this made it to the New York Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, there's no question who caused the fire. It was the sparks from the railroad that caused the fire and burned down these homes. However, we're not going to find the New York Central Railroad liable for the damage they've done, because it would cost them too much to pay this off, and it would stop the development of railroads in America. So what did you do? You essentially gave carte blanche to polluters. And the next dozen years or so, there was a huge drop in the annual number of applications for patents on spark repressors, because there was no need to produce them anymore. If the government was saying it's fine, you can start fires wherever you want, and we're not going to find you liable for this. There was a similar case like this, a very famous case in the Chesapeake Bay, where there were private oyster beds on the floor of the bay, and as the towns were growing, Norfolk, they had more and more reason to get rid of the pollution, and so what they were doing was taking wastewater and putting it in long pipes that went out into the bay, and these pipes were dumping this out over the oyster beds. And of course, oysters are very sensitive to pollutants, as are people who eat oysters that have been poisoned with pollutants. And so the oyster bed owners took their court to the Virginia Supreme Court, and the Virginia Supreme Court argued that it was in the best interest, the common good utilitarian argument, to protect all the people, because the only way we're going to grow is find ways to get rid of our waste products, and this is the way to go. We can't let some single individual oyster farmer stand in the way of progress and growth in America. It was examples like this that led into the problems we had. Now, that's sort of a brief overview of why this wasn't an example of pollutant levels of pollution and environmental degradation we've seen in air and water pollution in the United States. Was not an example of market failure, but an example of government failure, or government failure to allow markets to try to resolve these things through a property rights nexus of injunctions and compensation for harm, or various trade-offs. Now, another key part of free market environmentalism is the very important concept of the tragedy of the commons, and which many of you may know was written by Garrett Hardin, biologist and human ecologist. And the concept of the tragedy of the commons is when you have a resource that's open for use by everybody. He took the example of the medieval grazing pastures, and everybody had an equal right to go graze their cattle on it. And as population grew, more and more people would be putting their cattle on it, and people would be putting additional cattle on it, and then you began to have overgrazing of the pasture, but nobody had an incentive not to graze because it was going to harm them. So more and more people were putting more and more cattle on the pasture. You would try to get your cattle out there earlier in the morning so they could get whatever new growth came up that night or whatever before the next person came along. And inevitably, this would lead to the destruction of the commons and to the destruction of that society. And you can see that right down the line with example after example. This is essentially what led to the creation of the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s, because when we created property ownership, homesteading laws in the West, while the acreage that was allowed under homesteading in the East, where there was plentiful water, worked very well for a homestead. Once you got out into the Great Plains, you got out in areas where drier and drier, you needed more and more land, yet the government had not allowed people to homestead on the levels that they needed to actually ranch out there or to farm. And so people essentially did not fence things in. You had sort of common grazing of cattle. And again, with the cattle grazing all across the West, you had a classic example of the tragedy of the commons. More and more grass was overgrazed. This was eventually replaced by weeds, and then eventually simply by dust. And this is a classic example of not allowing a system of property ownership to develop that caused destruction of the Great Plains. Another classic example where you see this is in overfishing. Again, if a fishery is open to everybody, everybody's in a race to catch the last fish before the next fisherman comes along. And with species after species of fish, this is what has happened traditionally. You've seen the fish be overfished to the point where it was they were essentially economically extinct. It cost you more to catch them than you could sell them for. And that fishery would collapse, and then they would go on to the next fishery. Now, in many spots of the world, many places of the world, this never happened because they allowed a system of property rights, of ownership of fisheries, or a particular stock of fish, or all the fish that were in a particular stream. This was very common in Great Britain, common in Norway, common in Iceland, in which people who lived along a salmon stream, where the salmon would be going upstream to spawn, they had the exclusive right to fish in a particular area, which was essentially their property. And they could prevent other people from fishing there, and they were the only ones who were allowed to fish there, and they could set up a fishing club and allow people to become members and so on, and then set their own rules as to what you can catch and what you can't catch. And because they had recognized property rights, the courts upheld, in this case, the courts always upheld the right of the fishery owners in Great Britain. And so, unlike the east coast of the United States with the Atlantic salmon, it's the same species of salmon, the salmon disappeared here because we never had that kind of system. Anybody could go in and pollute at will, put dams on the river, have log drives down the river, whatever, to the point where salmon vanished from the northeastern United States and a good part of maritime provinces of Canada, while they were thriving in the rivers in Great Britain and in Iceland. And again, the same sort of thing happened with hunting. The question of overhunting. Again, everybody's out to shoot the last deer or the last grouse or whatever it is before the next person comes along. And that has been resolved in many areas, both in Europe and to some degree in the United States, by allowing landowners to own the wildlife that's on their land. I mean, in this country, we had, at one time, we had so many prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse and all these birds that lived across the prairies. This is what fed many of the big cities in the United States. These things, they would be shot in the thousands and tens of thousands and shipped to the markets in Chicago and Milwaukee, Buffalo, whatever, in train loads and sold in all the markets, and eventually they began to disappear. Now in Great Britain, you had a different kind of situation in which, particularly in northern England and in Scotland, with the grouse, the red grouse, and which was owned by the landowners who owned the land, and so they managed their land to protect grouse, and they were the only ones, they could set their season for themselves and how many they were going to be taken per day and so on. And you'll still see in parts of England, you'll see calendars in which the 15th of August, the glorious 15th, is outlined in red as a special day because that was the day that the that grouse season opened. And many people have also argued that another thing that markets did is that market hunting for markets, if you sell wild game, it will disappear, and that's why it disappeared. And again, they missed the whole thing. The reason that it disappeared, so many game species disappeared, was simply because nobody owned them. There was no ownership. Anybody could come and hunt them. It had nothing to do with markets. And in fact, an example of that in Great Britain, in Scotland, is that on the 15th, the grouse, that morning, almost all the estates have grouse hunters who come and pay a very substantial fee for the right to shoot the grouse. They're driven by people on the estates and go through the fields, and the grouse fly up in front of them, and here and there along the line, the hunters are all behind a hedge or a wall and shoot the grouse. But they don't get the grouse belong to the landowner. They just get the pleasure of shooting the grouse. Meanwhile, as soon as the first grouse are shot, somebody picks them up. They gut them, put them in containers with ice and so on, drive them to the nearest airport, fly them down to Heathrow, and restaurants in London vie with each other to see who can be the first restaurant in London to have grouse on the glorious 15th. I mean, you couldn't get more of a market. And the grouse are thriving and well protected, and again, it's a property rights issue. And you do see this somewhere in the United States, some of the species that are thriving. A few states like Texas and so on are now allowing landowners to own, if they put high fences on their land, to actually own the white-tailed deer that are behind those fences, and they were managed very, very, very well. And in fact, throughout Texas, in parts of New Mexico, on many of the ranches, you have all kinds of hunting of game species, of various antelope species and so on from all over the world that are thriving on Texas ranches because they're managing them monetarily for hunting, while they are disappearing or nearing extinction from overharvest in the native countries in Africa or parts of Asia. And also one example, about 20 years ago, the country of Namibia decided to change their constitution to allow landowners to own the wildlife that was on their land, because they saw that landowners were in constant competition with their cattle, and they wanted more cattle because that they owned and they could sell legally and so on. And so they would try to push out the wildlife or fence water holes so just their cattle could get to it. And so they decided, no, let's let the landowners own all the land, and so they'll have an opportunity to have hunting and harvest of all these different species. And then, of course, they had strong incentives to manage for all those species, and you could bring in far more hunters from all over the world who would want to have a chance to legally hunt for an elephant or this kind of gazelle or that kind of gazelle, and it was no longer considered a pest or a threat to the survival of their cattle, because they were often making far more money from hunting for wildlife or for trophies or for furs, skins to hang on your wall. And once again, this showed when the incentives are right through property rights and ownership, the market seems to work very, very well in these areas. And there are a lot more issues like that. One classic example, some of you may know the Institute of Economic Affairs in Great Britain. I knew Anthony Fisher, who founded that very well. He's a very interesting person. He he was in the war, World War II, the pilot. Afterwards, he came out and didn't know what he wanted to do. As you know, Great Britain had a very socialist economy at that time. And he found out that one area in which there was no government controls was the broiler chicken industry, because there had never been one. He had discovered it in the United States, and so he started the broiler chicken industry. He became a multi-millionaire, made a lot of money, but he discovered the miracle of the market. He said, I did this only by bringing the price of chicken down from, 3 pounds of chicken or something to 1 pound of chicken. And so it was good for me and good for the people. And he then, at one point, went down to the Cayman Islands, which were protected of Great Britain, and discovered that one of the big problems they were having down there was that sea turtles were disappearing. Sea turtles everywhere in the world were being over-harvested by everybody, both the eggs on the beaches and development of beaches, and the turtles were taken for tortoiseshell, and for the leather, and for the meat, and so on. And he found out that the problem was that in the wild, for about every 1,000 eggs that turtles lay, only one of those ever becomes an adult. And it takes something like 30 to 40 years for it to reach breeding age. And so if there's a tragedy, the common kind of harvest on sea turtles, they're going to disappear, they're going to go extinct. And he said, well, one thing I know how to do is raise the hell out of eggs. And so he said, what I'll do is just start a sea turtle farm, and we'll eliminate the predators and so on. And so he started a very successful sea turtle farm. And they were producing turtles like mad, and they were getting in the first and second generation. At first they said, okay, if you bring a turtle in, or you bring eggs in and hatch them, then you can't sell those. You have to wait till the next generation grows up, and then you could sell their young. And then after they succeeded that, then the Greens said, no, that's not enough. You have to do still another generation, trying to find, and eventually they simply closed them down. They banned all trade in sea turtle products throughout the world, even if they came from farms, which was saving them. And they're producing more on the farms. They could produce like 500 for every 1,000 eggs. And they were releasing a certain percentage of their young turtles back into the wild on the very original beaches where they had been collected, because the turtles unerringly go out, they'll be out in the ocean for 40 years, they'll come back to the very beach, somehow or other, thousands of miles away, that they hatched out on. But it turned out that when you look at the attitude of the Greens, the philosophy they have, they would rather see wildlife go extinct under socialism than to thrive under capitalism. And we've seen that in species after species, and that there have been opportunities to save species by farming and ranching, and the environmentalists have been adamantly opposed to that. Now, another major problem that we have is the problem of who owns the land in America. I don't know if you're aware of the levels, but when you look at government land ownership in America versus private land ownership, well over 40% of all the land in the United States is owned by the state at one level or another. This means federal ownership, state ownership, county ownership, and local ownership. And it may even be up as high as 50%. I mean, we don't even have accurate data on this. In what, the 105th Congress tried to get the GAO demanded that they come out with a study, that they finally do a study to find out how much land in the United States is owned by government, what lands are owned by government, what lands are owned by different levels of government. And the GAO, unfortunately, probably the congressmen who asked for that, they were all freshman congressmen. That was the year that the conservative Republicans took over the House. Simply didn't have enough clout, and so GAO simply blew them off and said, well, it would cost too much money and take too much time to do the study, so we're not going to do it. So we still don't know how much is owned, but we do know on the raw data that we have been able to get access to is well over 40%, nearing 50%. And it's very interesting. This is a quote from back in 1981 from a very noted economist who said, the public lands of the United States exceed the combined areas of Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, Hungary, and Albania. Where socialized ownership of land is concerned, only the USSR and China can claim company with the United States. Now, I imagine most of you think, well, that was probably somebody like Milton Friedman who pointed that out. And the interesting thing that it was liberal John Kenneth Galbraith who was so stunned when he saw those figures and worked that out. And what has happened since, of course, is that the amount of government land ownership in the United States has been growing. I mean, it's even growing now when the nation's essentially, you know, when we're in a major recession or bankrupt, $15 trillion national debt. They're still taking more land, buying more lands, and the lands they have, instead of managing them well, they're simply locking them up in either wilderness or quasi-wilderness, so no one can get access to them, and you don't even know what's in there. You've never even surveyed those lands. You don't know what mineral resources might be in there, what energy resources might be in there. They're simply being locked up. And I mean, again, you might ask the question of what is the environmental movement really seeking, really trying to do? And that original figure of 40% and the figures that Galbraith used were basically just the federal lands. I mean, we also got the state, county, and local lands. And so now we're most likely the United States is the most socialist land-owning country in the world. And what this really means is the way I see it, the way many people see it, is that we are headed down the road to serfdom, and the road to serfdom is now being paved with green bricks instead of red bricks. And you can't maintain a free society if the government owns all the land, and the lion's share of both the land and the natural resources. Increasingly, America is becoming the king's forest, the king's land, the king's wildlife, and we may have to become Robin Hoods in order to survive. Now, fortunately, one thing to wrap up on, there's a long tradition in America of private conservation, of the private sector going out and owning things. And it sort of falls back into Tocqueville's idea of one of the unique things about America when they saw a problem, when things were disappearing, or wildlife was disappearing, or habitat was disappearing, or some scenic area was going to be developed, people would step in and find ways to save it. And we've had all kinds of things. I mean, going back to 1774, when Natural Bridge of Virginia, I don't know those people, how many of you have seen that down in Shenandoah, was purchased by Thomas Jefferson to save for all the people. It's considered one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. It's still privately owned to this day, and it's as beautiful and fantastic as if when Jefferson was there. The only thing now, it's paved underneath, the bridge so you don't have to get your feet wet walking up the creek under the bridge. And everything else, you can find private wildlife refuges, there are private parks, private forests. One of the interesting things about private forests is private foresters can't afford to manage their forests like the federal government. When they get infested with, they find beetles or insects coming into the forest, they immediately go in and spray them. It's almost impossible to do, cut out the trees that are infected and burn them to get rid of it. They clear out and thin out the trees because private landowners can't afford to let their forests burn. Government landowners have now gotten into position where that's part of the philosophy of how they manage the forest. So on all of these different things, everything that we've been told that you need the government to do, whether it's a national park, they're private parks, they're private wilderness areas around the country, all of these things can be done and done better and done morally by the private sector. So I think one of the last great things that we have to do in free market environmentalism is not only talk about it more, but begin a massive program of privatization and taking these lands and resources out of the hands of the state and putting them into moral private ownership where they'll be managed well for the good of people who do want to use them instead of mismanaged. And that's the last way, the only way I think we're going to maintain a free and prosperous society and a sound and healthy environment. So that's my overview.
Thank you. We're going to have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. I'm also going to pass around a survey that we'd like you to complete and give your comments. And if you could hand me the survey on your way out after the Q&A is finished, that would be great. Also, if you need pens, just flag me down for that. But
yeah, and if any of you are really interested in the subject of free market environmentalism or interested in doing research in the future in some of these areas or whatever, any of us would be happy to help you. You can contact me easily. I got cards here, but it's just rjsmith@cei.org. rjsmith@cei.org. And be happy to try and give you some leads or books to look at, or something that might make a great thesis or dissertation, whatever.
I see a question?
Yeah. What would you see as the solution to the problems of open water fishing? It would be hard to have property rights to huge areas of the sea, I suppose.
Well, this is beginning to develop. In Iceland, and particularly in New Zealand, it's most developed to some degree in Australia, the concept of ITQs, individual tradable quotas, in which they're sort of closing down the commons and increasingly restricting it to fewer and fewer people who have the right to fish. And they might start with the initial number of fishermen, and some of these are very small fishermen who just go out and fish a few times a day. And so some of the larger fishermen have more to gain from that, would buy out their rights and so on, and then have exclusivity to fish in a particular area or a particular stock of fish. And this has worked extremely well in Iceland, and extremely well in New Zealand, and to some degree in Iceland. But New Zealand has reached the point now where they have so many of their fisheries, both bottom fish and pelagic fish when they're moving through certain areas, as well as lots of shellfish that are now privately owned under this system, that the fishermen themselves are now managing the situation themselves. And they realize, and in fact they're even being stricter in the quotas they take and so on than the government was doing, because they have the best data. They're the ones who stand to lose the most if they overfish their own resource now that they own it. Now there's no tragedy of the commons anymore, so you're not in this constant race of fishing more and more and more intensively and faster and getting bigger boats and bigger nets and so on, to the point where the whole process becomes uneconomic. But now they're able to slowly take the time to really understand the resource, to figure out whether they're overfishing themselves or not, and it's working extremely well. And a couple fisheries, some of the clam fisheries off of Long Island, have been developed in that way. And the biggest thing that stands in the way of extending ITQs further has simply been the fact that we're sort of hidebound in this. It's tradition. People still want the freedom of the seas or something. Or just like people wanted the freedom to go anywhere you wanted to across the Great Plains before it was owned by farmers. And that's sort of hard to deal with in lots of communities, lots of countries. A small country like Iceland, for instance, everybody thinks, well, gee, I should have the right to fish. And we can't do this. Now, one of the things that also could have been done with whales is extend, the concept of, we extend the concept of ownership of whales or whale herds to the first people who started harvesting those whales. Because, I mean, now it's much easier than it was in the past. I mean, now you can put little beepers on your whales and know where they are at all times. You can find out from satellites whether somebody else's boats are coming in those areas. You can pinpoint the exhaust from different boats and figure out what boat it was. So there are ways to manage these areas well, whether it's an open fishery or not. And then again, you've avoided the tragedy of the commons.
Okay.
So I find this topic really intriguing, and I think the idea of sort of a property rights structure works really well with things like shared pastures and water pollution, but one thing where I think it might fail us is you didn't really talk about global climate change. And there's no, how do I quantify the share of a climate that I own? How do I quantify that? And particularly versus how much my neighbor owns. We're not talking about a neighbor that I can go negotiate a contract with. We're talking about a global neighbor that lives many hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away. So I think it's a little bit more complicated.
Certainly, it's much more. It's about as complicated as can be. I mean, you picked one of the most difficult issues. Obviously, that's something you should probably do your dissertation on. And let me know. And also, I mean, in the first place, regardless of how much anthropogenic climate change there is, and I think there's relatively little. I mean, I think the whole history of climate change, ice ages and intervening warm periods and so on, and then replaced by more ice ages, on and on and on. With CO2 historically, I mean, over time going in different directions, and hard to find those correlations. I mean, I think the only constant in nature is that there are no constants. The nature is constantly changing, and that makes it extremely difficult to find any way to deal either through government or through markets with climate change. Particularly if most of it is natural. I mean, just like you have natural possession of ecosystems, so a forest ecosystem or something. From a, you got a field, the beaver builds a dam on the field, and becomes, more and more soils are packed up there. Small trees begin to grow. 20 years later, bigger trees and so on, until the trees get so old they fall down and die. I mean, those kind of changes are representative of all of Mother Nature. That didn't answer your question, but I don't think anybody knows how to answer that question. I'm not saying this is, not a panacea that, I mean, the institutions of a free society, property rights, markets, and prices are going to solve every problem. They're going to solve a hell of a lot more problems than otherwise. I mean, the government's not solving problems. The government's been making everything worse in every possible area, as far as I can see.
Yeah, basically I lived in Iceland for a while myself, actually, so I know firsthand the ITQ system to be established there. And the problem really that what I want to hear your input of is how do you address the initial allocation of those property rights?
Right.
Because in Iceland they use a system of grandfathering, which is not really societally acceptable to most people there. And still, basically the system now actually celebrates its 30th anniversary, and still 30 years later, people still have troubles, okay, just because some people fished during certain reference years, they now still own the quotas. On the other hand, auctioning is problematic as well, for the simple reasons that what about the capital that has already been invested in the industry? So what's your take on the initial allocation of property rights in such a system?
don't have an answer for that. It's just, I think the different countries are just going to have to work that out. It's going to probably be cultural differences in every different country and the size of the country. I mean, it's going to be much different for a country the size of the United States or Australia than it is for Iceland or the Faroes or something like that. I mean, one thing that I know that can work and has worked was the development over the ages in Iceland of their allowing essentially ownership to individual farmers of the right to the eiders that nested on their land, so they and only they could collect the highly valuable eider down, instead of eiders just being available for anybody to go out and shoot and kill the golden egg and kill the goose that laid the golden egg, get the eider. They've allowed ownership of harvesting of eggs of seabirds, of puffins and murres and gulls on cliffs in Iceland and so on. There's been property rights systems that have worked out there. So again, even in a very sort of insular society, something that everybody at one time or another thought they had the right to go out and gather eggs or something, wild eggs from the seabirds during the spring and early summer, even that became privatized. So I think there is hope and opportunity that even something as much more difficult as fisheries, ocean fisheries, can be worked out. But I mean, there are fisheries economists who are working on that particular thing, along with sociologists, to see how they can balance all of that.
I think 2 more questions. Over there.
One of the things that I found, I agree with everything in this presentation.
Good for you.
I've taken a class on it before, but when I go into a conversation with somebody who's not really familiar with libertarianism or this idea, how do you say, I think you should have the right to own an endangered species? Because all the hard data says that this is going to help them. If you look at things like the bison, any sort of animal that has been privatized, or examples with like salmon in the northwestern United States, or some species of fish. But consistently, it comes down to this moral dilemma that people seem to have, that you should be able to own something endangered. How have you managed to overcome those objections to people's sense of morality?
Well, I mean, we haven't. That's one of the reasons that we're still losing,
right.
Losing so many species. I mean, for instance, in the area of birds, particularly the parrot family, there's huge demand for parrots around the world, and the attitude of most governments, the United States government through the Endangered Species Act, and the Community of Nations through CITES, Convention on International Trade on Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, have essentially banned all trade in members of the parrot family. I mean, there are all kinds of other species that they have too, including that they've made it extremely difficult to even have trade in captive bred parrots. I mean, you can with most species of wildlife, you can usually breed them fairly well in captivity, sometimes extremely well, particularly with members of the parrot family and so on. You just have to get a few conditions right and they'll breed like mad. And then you can trade these up all around the world. But you can't, because most countries, increasingly, Australia is particularly strict on this. And what this does leads to 2 things. One, it leads to black market in trade in some of these species, and you have some of these extremely rare parrots and macaws and so on that nest in cavities in trees. Usually these are cavities made by large woodpeckers or something like that, or occasionally a natural cavity that occurs in a tree. And the way you catch them, the way you get them, is you go out and you chop down the tree when it falls down. When you know there's at nighttime or something, when you know the adult might be in there, the mother might be in there, or when you waited long enough, you know they're nesting, and you know that there's 4 young parrots in there at the age that you could feed them and so on. And many of them die in that process, and you've eliminated another nesting site in the forest by taking down that tree. And then the smuggling activities that they go the way they try to smuggle them into the country, you know, put them in nylon stockings or put them in nets or put them inside of a potato chip container or something like that, or put them inside a hubcap of a car to smuggle them across the border. Vast numbers of these die, and if you just legalize the trade. And one of the crazy things in Australia, again to show the nonsense in wildlife and environmental laws, is that so many of the big species of parrots in Australia and cockatoos and so on come in such gigantic flocks, they just devastate agricultural areas. And so the government lets you go out and shoot them, kill them, poison them. You can go out in the outback in areas and you'll find trails of poisoned grain for 5 miles long along the side of a highway. And of course it's killing everything it's eating, whether it's little marsupial mice or rats or squirrels or something like that, and all these birds. And yet they won't allow you to trap those birds and sell them, which many, I mean, some of the prices, you know, $10,000 for certain members of the cockatoo family, or $12,000 in the market. Many of the cattle stations in Australia could trap, you know, a dozen of those or something, and sell them internationally in 1 year, and probably make more money than they were making from all their farming operation, from all their ranching operation, from either cattle or sheep, and do far less harm to the land. But once again, the government has this idea that they would, or the environmentalists do, who control the government environmental departments, that they would seem to rather see something go extinct under socialism and thrive under capitalism. And I mean, I just don't get it. I think it's insane.
All right, I think we're actually going to end there. Sorry, if you still have a question. Well, thank you. If you could hand me and surveys on the way out, we'll do it.
Yeah. Have you done any work with the
Yeah.